want to start by saying welcome to this event. My name is Stephanie Saliwoda. I'm the director of Stanford and Oxford, and we normally help host Dr. Roxana Biasu's Philosophy Forum talks, but so now we're in a virtual space and we wanted to help this talk to happen virtually and I think internationally and across the world. So I'm very excited to hand over to Roxana and hear about today's talk.
Okay, yeah, so welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Dan Zahavi. It's a great pleasure to have him on at the Oxford Forum at Stanford and Oxford. I will say a few words about Professor. I introduced Professor Dan Zahavi. I'm sure many of you know him, but since there are people from all over the world and from various disciplines, I will briefly say a few things about him. So Professor Zahavi is a professor of philosophy at the University of Copenhagen and the University of Oxford. He is the director of the Center for Subjectivity Research at the University of Copenhagen. Professor Zahavi works in the field of phenomenology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychiatry, and cognitive science. He has written extensively in the areas of both pure phenomenology, particularly Husserl's phenomenology, and applied phenomenology. Some of the main topics that he is concerned with in his work are the following. The issues of selfhood, self-consciousness, intersubjectivity, empathy, shame, and collective intentionality, among others. While working on these issues, Professor Zahavi has collaborated and debated with psychiatrists, and he has promoted the collaboration and exchanges between philosophy and empirical sciences, in particular psychiatry. He's now working on two main big issues. First, how to apply phenomenology in qualitative research. And second, how to understand the nature of the we, hence his interest in notions such as intersociality, intersubjectivity, and community. He has published many books and numerous articles. I will just name a few books that he published. So in 2019, Phenomenology, the Basics. And this year, a new edition of his book of Self-Awareness and Alterity, a Phenomenological Investigation. Another book by him with Oxford University Press is Self and Other, Exploring Subjectivity, Empathy and Shame. And he also edited for Oxford University Press the Oxford Handbook of the History of Phenomenology and the Oxford Handbook of Contemporary Phenomenology. And I think, this coming year, a third edition of a book that he co-edited with Sean Gallagher will come out, namely The Phenomenological Mind. In recent years, there has been a significant growth of research and publications in the field of philosophy and psychiatry. And today, Professor Zahavi will talk precisely about this relation, the relation between philosophy and psychiatry. So, I will hand it now to Professor Zahavi.
Thank you so much. Let me try to share my screen. And I also, before starting, just want to thank Roxana very much for the invitation and for this occasion. I would, of course, have loved to be in Oxford to give the talk, but I guess there's one advantage of doing it online, which is that far more people are able to attend the talk. And so I'm very much looking forward to sharing these ideas with you and hopefully also getting some interesting questions by the end. Okay, so the topic that I want to talk about is philosophy and psychiatry. And I think from the start there has been a troublesome relationship between the two disciplines. This psychiatry, should it embrace or should it distance itself from this heritage that it has had? And if one goes back, and I will come with some examples in a moment, if one goes back to some of the founding fathers of psychiatry, they very much believed that philosophical knowledge would be indispensable for psychiatry's development as a proper science and for the clinical practice. And the question, of course, is whether that is true or whether it would actually rather improve the credentials of psychiatry if it turns its back on philosophy and became more like the other medical specialties. But let me give you a couple of examples of some of these founding fathers who very much had a positive view on the role of philosophy. So Karl Jaspers is primarily known for his massive volume, General Psychopathology, which came out in 1913 and which turned out to be a very, very influential work, influencing both psychiatry primarily in the UK and in Germany. And one of the things that is very clear in this book is that Jaspers thinks that psychiatry is in need of philosophical tools and distinctions. And he even declares at one point, and here I quote, that the psychiatrist's competence is really commensurate with how far his education and knowledge would qualify him to belong to the faculty of philosophy. 1 year before the publication of Allgemeine Psychopathologie, Jaspers also published a short article basically discussing the role of phenomenology in psychopathology. And he insisted that Husserlian phenomenology could be of use to psychiatry. And I think given the subject matter of psychopathology, given the subject matter of the study of anomalous experiences, I don't think this proposal is so surprising, because if we consider some of the experiential categories that are afflicted in different psychiatric conditions, say temporal experiences or spatial experiences, or the demarcation of self and no self, or the experience of one's own body, I think that the relevance of phenomenological resources is pretty obvious. Phenomenology has for a long time provided very extensive analysis of topics like experience of time, experience of space, experience of the body, experience of the self. And in providing those analyses, phenomenology has also developed tools that ought to be useful for any psychiatrist who might be interested in really understanding the patient's experience. Now, the main claim made by Jaspers is that psychiatry is to make scientific progress, it really has to include and consider and examine the experiential perspective of the patient. And as I already mentioned, I mean, this very, very detailed investigation that he offers in General Psychopathology. I mean, it was a book that came out in several editions, and it ended up being more than 700 pages long. So there are a lot of descriptions in it. It turned out to be very influential in the development of psychiatry. Now, another early figure who also should be mentioned is Minkowski. He originally studied medicine, philosophy, and mathematics. He worked with Bleuler at the famous clinic in Burghölzli in Switzerland, and eventually became the chief psychiatrist at a leading hospital in Paris. Now, some years afterwards, he published a book he published many books, but one book perhaps in particular to highlight is the book from 1927, La Schizophrenie, which some people have assessed as one of the most as one of the best clinical works on schizophrenia ever written. And it's interesting that many years later, the well-known figure of Lang argued that Minkowski was the first to make a really serious attempt in psychiatry to reconstruct the other person's lived experience. And so Lang himself was influenced by Minkowski's work. Now, again, in Minkowski's work, we find also specific considerations about the relationship between philosophy and psychiatry. And Minkowski writes that even though there are those people who use the term philosophical pejoratively, in his view, philosophy is of crucial value for the clinical practice. And more specifically, what Minkowski was doing was exploring and exploiting ideas from both Bergson and Husserl, and arguing that one, by adopting a phenomenological framework and approach, could obtain a certain understanding of the patient's otherwise incomprehensible world, and thereby also extend psychiatric knowledge. Now, let me give you one example of how Minkowski proceeded. So one of his central ideas, and this is actually an idea that marks an important difference between him and Jaspers, was that he thought that the task of the psychopathologist, the task of the psychiatrist engaging with patients, wasn't simply to observe and describe and register the frequency of the symptoms that are present, but that the psychiatrist, in order to offer a proper diagnosis, really had to go beneath the surface symptoms in order to try to find the kind of gestalt, the kind of organizing structure of which these different symptoms were expressions. And so Minkowski is basically arguing that if one simply looks at florid delusions or hallucinations, I mean, they might vary quite a lot from individual to individual. And he also argues that they are not really the core affliction. They are rather secondary reactions to the more fundamental core of the illness, which in the case of schizophrenia, Minkowski took to be what he called a loss of vital contact with reality. Now, what is that supposed to mean? And I think that it's perhaps easiest to understand what he has in mind if one thinks about the so-called negative symptoms rather than the positive symptoms of kind of, again, florid delusions or hallucinations. Minkowski talked about this vital contact with reality as an ability to resonate with the world, to be affected by and act suitable in an intersubjective world. And he argued that what characterizes the patient with schizophrenia is that the patient loses this basic non-reflective attunement with the world, and with himself and with others. And so what kind of existential condition does the patient find himself or herself in? Well, it's a condition where nothing can be taken for granted, everything can be questioned, nothing is self-evident any longer, and many of the features that we in normal life simply take for granted is suddenly something that calls for explicit notice and attention, which again leads to a kind of pathological heightened form of both attention and self-monitoring. And I have a quote not from Minkowski, but from a later German psychiatrist called Wolfgang Blankenburg, who has a very long description of a patient called Anne. And this is one description that she gives that I think nicely captures this loss of a vital contact that Minkowski was talking about. So Anne is saying as follows: what is it that I really lack? Something so small, so comic, but so unique and important that you cannot live without it. I find that I no longer have footing in the world. I have lost a hold in regard to the simplest everyday things. What I lack really is the natural evidence. It's not knowledge, it is something that every child is equipped with. It is these very simple things a human being has the need for to carry on life, how to act, to be with other people, to know the rules of the game. Now, obviously, the kind of Jaspers-Minkowski tradition in psychiatry is not the only one. One alternative strategy is that instead of focusing on psychopathology, instead of highlighting the importance of that, instead of paying careful attention to the experiential disorders or disturbances, I mean, why not just go directly to neurology or neurobiology in order to determine the real underlying cause of the mental disorder? And I think one, kind of extreme version of this orientation has occasionally been called the broken brain paradigm. The idea being that mental disorders are primarily a result of malfunctioning brain mechanisms. And some people advocating this position would also be prepared to say that the first person reports of the patients, the symptoms reported by the patients, are not really reliable indicators of the underlying cause. And if one wants to get at that cause, well, then it's time better invested. You better invest your time in kind of investigating the brain rather than spending time listening to and interviewing the patient. So one might see a certain tension here between the kind of person-centered approach that we find in Jaspers and Minkowski vis-a-vis a more subpersonal brain circuit-centered approach. That, of course, was already a kind of tension that Minkowski and Jaspers were familiar with, because in the same generation, there were psychiatrists favoring this approach. One, again, a founding father of scientific psychiatry is Kraepelin, who took psychiatry to be a branch of the medical sciences and who argued that the methods of psychiatry should be those of the natural sciences. Kraepelin was very dismissive of philosophy. He thought philosophical ideas were unscientific and should be shunned. And I think it's kind of interesting that early in his career, Kraepelin was chair of psychiatry at a university in Estonia, where he was responsible for the treatment of patients, the majority of which spoke Estonian and with whom he could not directly communicate. And so, of course, perhaps if you find yourself in that situation, you might be more inclined to then conduct investigations of the brain. Now, biological psychiatry is, of course, not simply a thing of the past. And I think that currently and during the last 10 years, the so-called RDoC initiative, which is an initiative launched by the National Institute of Mental Health. So RDoC is an abbreviation for the research domain criteria, is very much has the ambition of trying to pull psychiatry out of its alleged backward position and to place it on the same level as the rest of medicine. And so what is being argued for here is the need for a more neuroscientific approach to the study of mental disorders. And importantly, the main idea in the RDoC initiative is that rather than basing the classification of mental disorders as the so-called DSM manual does, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the one that has primarily been used in the US, rather than basing the classification of mental disorders on descriptions of symptoms, on kind of clinical descriptions of symptoms, what is needed instead is a more bottom-up approach where the classification is based on neuroscientific markers. And the hope is that will somehow provide psychiatry with a more solid scientific foundation. So again, obviously from this perspective, the focus is really on neural circuitries and their dysfunctions. And the question is whether this cannot be seen as a certain return to the broken brain paradigm. And one might wonder whether that line of approach, I mean, how open to both philosophy and psychopathology it will actually be. Now, in a kind of in one of the early papers outlined the RDoC initiative, Incel and colleagues basically argued that the focus is on neural circuitry with levels of analysis then progressing in one of two directions: upwards from measures of circuitry function to clinically relevant variation, or downwards to the genetic and molecular cellular function that ultimately influence such function. Now, I think one question to ask is whether that is really realistic. I mean, is it really realistic to start one's psychiatric investigation at the level of neural circuitry? Because, I mean, why would we be prompted to conduct an investigation of a supposedly dysfunctional brain unless the behavior of the patient or the first person reports of the patient suggested that something was amiss? So I think there is something slightly odd with claiming that the starting point of a psychiatric investigation is neural circuitry. I mean, I don't really understand how that is possible. But another point that could be made is, and here I will quote Nagel, the American philosopher Thomas Nagel, who once made the case that if we want to conduct a coherent reductionism, and I don't think there's any question that the RDoC initiative is a reductionistic kind of approach, well, then it's crucial that the entity to be reduced, the explanandum, is properly characterized. I mean, if we want to find a neural cause of, say, depersonalization, of thought insertion, it seems important to get a grip on its personal level manifestation, because if we start out with a mischaracterization of the explanandum, the explanation will allegedly be either worthless or misleading. And I think that just shows that the idea of somehow being able to circumvene the personal level description, I mean, I find that problematic. But here's another point to make. I think it's important, if one wants to engage in psychiatry, to understand that psychiatry is not just faced with a number of factual and empirical problems, but that's a central part of its undertaking. It also involves a number of conceptual, epistemological, and metaphysical problems. What do I mean by this? Well, consider the fact that Schneider, another famous German psychiatrist who came up with a so-called list of first-rank symptoms of schizophrenia, that is, symptoms which, if present, are strongly suggestive of schizophrenia, that among these first-rank symptoms, many of them involved what is called a lowering of the barrier between self and the surrounding world, or the loss of the very contours of the self. So this is I mean, this way of talking about the symptoms was supposed, again, to grasp some of the very severe disturbances that the patients were experiencing. And let me give you a few first-person reports to illustrate what might be at stake here. And so all of these are patient reports. I constantly regard myself. Sometimes it's so pronounced that I can hardly follow what's going on TV. Even during a conversation with others, I observe myself to the point of having difficulty in grasping what my interlocutors are saying. Here's another report. My own eye, as a point of perspective, feels as if it has shifted a few centimeters backwards. Or again, I do not really feel as a human subject, as a person with a soul. I feel like a dispensable thing, like, say, a refrigerator. Or a final one. Sometimes I get thoughts about death that are not my own thoughts, but I can't say that they are yours or someone else's. I can't figure out whose thought it is that I get into my head. I can never figure out who gives me these thoughts. So again, I think in different ways, one can see these reports as expressing a certain disturbance, a certain anomaly in self-experience. And the problem, of course, is, I mean, if that is what the psychiatry has to engage with in the diagnosis, can we just assume that we all know what a self is? Again, this is a crucial part of Schneider's description of these first-rank symptoms. Likewise, I mean, if you are a psychiatrist and if you want to, employ the normal diagnosis, I mean, you will refer to delusions or hallucinations, compulsions. And again, do we know what all of these things mean unless we have some understanding of the nature of reality, normality, rationality, and agency? So again, the point is, I mean, this is very different, I think, from the kind of challenges that a person faced with somatic illness is confronted with. I mean, if a patient has broken his leg, I mean, we don't really need to engage with questions of this character in order to fix the problem or even to diagnose what is at stake. And of course, if you're talking about trying to understand or rely on a certain understanding, conception of reality, normality, selfhood, rationality, I mean, is that not what philosophers have done? So might there not be a role for philosophy to play here? And let me try to illustrate that by taking a closer look at the notion of selfhood and the way in which the notion of self has kind of reoccurred in neuroscience research recently. So here's a quick graph over the number of citations of articles dealing with self. I think it's both includes articles where self is included in the title and where self is included among the keywords. And it's a while since admittedly, let me admit that I've used this slide before. So it's a little bit since I harvested this. So this is only going up to 2017, but I mean, I would be very surprised if the kind of trajectory had not continued. And you can see how explosive the amount of neuroscience publications have been focusing on the self. Now, when then looking at neuroscience publications on the self, I think there are certain mistakes that what should be careful not to commit, and let me try to illustrate a few of them. So this is an article by Keenan and Platek and Gallup and other colleagues from 2004 entitled "Where Am I? The Neurological Correlates of Self and Other." In this article, the authors claim that the search for the localization of the self in the brain, so where in the brain is the self located, that has been the goal of consciousness research for centuries. And they then make the claim that the self, or when they are a little bit more careful, the neural correlate of the self resides in the right hemisphere of the brain, since areas in that part of the brain show more pronounced activity when the subject is recognizing depictions of self-face as compared to other familiar faces. And that is much to be said about this experimental paradigm. I think it has an obvious, it's obviously linked to the old mirror recognition tasks. There's this idea that recognizing one's own image somehow is specifically significant for testifying to the presence of self-experience, or self-consciousness, or specifying the possession of some kind of concept of self. In any case, the article in question contains a number of references to notions such as self-recognition, self-awareness, and self, but at no point in the article are any of these concepts defined. And why that is a problem, I will come back to in just a second. Here's another article, an article by the very well-known autism researcher Simon Baron-Cohen, where Baron-Cohen starts the article with the following passage. The idea that as a result of neurological factors, one might lose aspects of the self is scientifically important in that it offers the promise of teaching us more about what the self is. In this chapter, I do not tackle the thorny question of how to define the self. Rather, I accept that this word refers to something we recognize, and instead raise the question, are people with autism trapped for neurological reasons to be totally self-focused? So what we see here is basically, the same move as in the previous article. There's a strong emphasis on the notion of self, but no definition is provided. And supposedly the argument is that the notion of self is so self-evident that we don't really need to define it because we all know what it means. Now, if one goes a bit further into autism research, I think one will see some of the implications of this lack of an explicit definition. Because even though autism might primarily be viewed as a social disorder, I mean, a number of autism researchers have actually also, highlighted the fact that autism actually, in its very term, contains a link to selfhood. And if one looks at publications coming out, one will find rather divergent claims being made even by the very same authors. So here we have Baron-Cohen in 1989 saying that children with autism are mind blind, that they are unaware of their own mental states. He argues 2005 that classical autism involves a total focus on the self. And of course, one might ask, if you are mind blind, how can you then at the same time be totally focusing on yourself? We have Uta Frith and Franziska Happé in 1999 write that individuals with autism lack introspection and self-awareness. 4 years later, we are told that they do possess self-knowledge. We also hear that persons with autism have appropriate representations of the physical, psychological, and narrative self. This is actually 3 different selves being introduced. And again, in the same publication, we're also told that autism is characterized by an absent self. It's not totally clear to me how all of these different claims are compatible, but I think a charitable interpretation is that perhaps one reason why people are occasionally a little bit unclear about what they actually mean by the link between selfhood and autism is because very little time is being devoted to actually clarifying the very notion of self being employed. And here's a final example, which is a review article from 2005 by Gillihan and Farah, where they basically go over a lot of neuroscience literature on selfhood, considering where in the brain neuroscientists have argued that the neural correlate of the self is located. And as I'm sure should be pretty evident, there's a lot of places that have been suggested. There's no clear consensus about where in the brain the self is located. And ultimately, Gillihan and Farah concludes their overview by suggesting that it might be premature to subject selfhood to a neuroscientific investigation. Now, if one then moves into the philosophical discussion of selfhood, because again, I mean, remember, I think one premise behind the lack of any explicit definition was probably the assumption that the notion of self is so self-evident that we don't need to define it. And I mean, there's a clear contrast to this assumption if one looks at at the philosophical discussion, because that discussion is overly complex and diversified. Galen Strawson summarized, so he wrote a target article on the self in the Journal of Consciousness Studies back in 1999. Then a lot of people replied to his article, and in his reply to those comments, he summarized some of the, or he listed some of the notions of self that people had been referring to in their comments. And I think the total amount was something like 25 different notions of self, including the following: autobiographical self, narrative self, cognitive self, contextualized self, cause self, dialogical self, embodied self, empirical self, fictional self, minimal self, experiential self, normative self, neural self, and I mean, there are far more. So I think that given this situation, I mean, given the fact that people are very much disagreeing about exactly what selfhood is, I mean, it might make little sense to discuss where the neural correlate of the self is located if one does not at the same time make it clear what concept of self one is operating with and why one is operating with that specific notion. And so again, perhaps one of the explanations for the lack of consensus documented by Gillihan and Farah is that the different experimentalists are precisely operating with different notions of self. I mean, so again, depending on the experimental paradigm that you are using in your neuroscientific study, I mean, you might actually be targeting very different either aspects of self or different types of self. I mean, if you're asking people to report whether they are recognizing their own face compared to the face of unknown people, it's likely that that will target a different aspect than if you are asking people to list adjectives that they think characterize personal traits of themselves. And again, this might be different from what is happening in the brain if you contrast a movement that you are making on your own with the very same movement, the very same raising of the hand being performed by somebody else who are kind of moving your arm. So again, there's a lot of complexity here that needs to be factored in. And the fact that there is this complexity, I think, is not necessarily a bad thing, because it might precisely point to the fact that the self, rather than being self-evident, rather than being simple and easily understood, is actually a very complicated phenomenon that requires complementary accounts I mean, where one has to integrate complementary accounts to do justice to its complexity. And the obvious point here is, of course, that complexity necessitates conceptual / philosophical clarification. It doesn't make it superfluous. So I think that one of the dangers ones, if one says, you know, let's stay away from philosophy, let's try to get to the bottom of the nature of, you know, hallucinations, delusions, compulsions, self-disorders, simply by means of empirical research, is that empirical research is going to be organized and structured and motivated by various theoretical ideas. And if those ideas are not clear, it will also mean that the questions being posed are not clear, and that the experiments that are being designed in order to address the questions will also lack clarity. And I think that this is one of the places where philosophy obviously has a role to play. But I also think that philosophy might have another role to play in the case of psychiatry. I mean, again, just like any other science, psychiatry makes a number of assumptions about very basic epistemological and metaphysical domains, be it the nature of reality or the character of consciousness. And I think here that philosophy can simply, play a cautious role, might prevent psychiatry from falling into too facile a form of reductionism and scientism. But perhaps philosophy might also do something else when it comes to psychiatry, namely offer sophisticated reflections on the notions of normality and abnormality. Because consider the fact that these days more and more people receive diagnosis, which leads to increased pressure on the healthcare system with less and less time to each patient. And I think perhaps critical reflection is also needed here. I mean, is more and more wide-ranging diagnosis appropriate? I mean, should we accept that any deviation from normality should lead to pathologization and medicalization? Might philosophy not kind of again play a critical role here? So coming back to Jaspers, in general psychopathology, he makes two comments that I think are very pertinent, and let me just give you both quotes. Many a psychiatrist has said that he did not want to burden himself with a philosophy and that this science had nothing to do with philosophy. Nothing can be said against that, inasmuch as the correctness of scientific insights in general and in psychiatry is not proved by philosophy. But the exclusion of philosophy would nevertheless be disastrous for psychiatry. If we are not clearly conscious of our philosophy, we shall mix it up with our scientific thinking quite unawares and bring about a scientific and philosophic confusion. And again, a little bit later in the text, if anyone thinks he can exclude philosophy and leave it aside as useless, he will eventually be defeated by it in some obscure form or other. From this springs the mass of bad philosophy in psychopathological studies. So I guess one might, with Jaspers, say that psychiatry does not really have the choice to include or not to include philosophy. I mean, the only choice open for psychiatry is the choice between good or bad philosophy. Now, let me conclude my presentation by just quickly saying a little bit about philosophical psychiatry in Denmark. I mean, the two figures that I previously mentioned was, Minkowski and Jaspers, who are long dead. But that is not, of course, to say that philosophical psychiatry is not being practiced. And I would like to kind of conclude my talk by kind of informing you a little bit about what is going on in Denmark. So there has in recent years been a growing focus on the early identification and treatment of schizophrenia. And one of the reasons for this is that, roughly speaking, the earlier the treatment can start, the better the prognosis. And so because of that, there has been this reorientation, or at least it has led a number of psychiatrists to look at not kind of full-blown psychosis, but rather to look at and try to investigate kind of non-psychotic experiential anomalies, such as disturbed self-presence, a sense of being radically different from others, or fundamental perplexity vis-a-vis tacit social norms, because the presence of such anomalies could be taken to predict, a later, more severe development of a mental illness. And if one could already start treating people with these anomalies early on, I mean, perhaps one could prevent them from actually ever developing a full psychosis. So one of the things that has been explored through this investigation is that many children and adolescents who later on happen to develop schizophrenia. So this was also research that came out of a kind of high-risk study. I mean, studying children of parents with schizophrenia. So one were kind of for that reason already, attentive to whether they might have difficulties. Now, many of these individuals report that they, from early on, I mean, in school already, experienced a type of solitude that was very different from social isolation. It was a kind of fundamental existential feeling of being different from others. There's even a specific term in German psychopathology for this phenomenon, the feeling of being, undersigned. And importantly, I mean, this was not just about feeling, slightly different from others. I mean, having specific, easily to determine features or properties that differed from those of the children's peers. No, it was a much more kind of profound experience of being radically ontologically different from others. And so I think I remember one adolescent saying that it was a bit like feeling as a hippocampus among a group of giraffes. In any case, because of this early work, a group of psychiatrists, most of whom were based in Denmark, but also including a Norwegian and a German psychiatrist, then started developing a qualitative and semi-quantitative psychometric checklist called EASE, Examination of Anomalous Self-Experience. This was published in 2005 in the journal Psychopathology. Now, the checklist, which drew on many years of clinical work and was very heavily inspired and informed by ideas from philosophical phenomenology, was basically developed in order to assist and support a very kind of careful clinical exploration and assessment of subjective self-disorders, basically, subjective anomalies. And the results from this checklist, basically, I mean, one is asking the patient in a kind of semi-structured interview questions pertaining to a number of different experiential domains, and then this is then rated afterwards, and depending on which domains the patient rates highly in, I mean, that has a certain kind of can serve as a certain prognostic indicator for whether there's an increased likelihood for the patient to subsequently develop kind of psychosis. And it turned out that particular domains of self-disorders were relevant. Now, the scale has, in the meantime, been translated into 10 languages, so it's used over the world. And I think one of the most interesting impacts it has had is the following. I mentioned the DSM before, which is kind of the American diagnostic manual, and the kind of the manual used by WHO is called ICD. The old version, IDC-10, contained basically the following definition of schizophrenia. The schizophrenic disorders are characterized in general by fundamental and characteristic distortions of thinking and perception and affects that are inappropriate or blunted. Now, the ICD-11, which is basically coming out now, has an interesting addition, because when it talks about schizophrenia, it specifically mentions disturbed self-experiences in the very definition of schizophrenia. And I don't think there's much doubt that the reason for this change in large part has to do with all the work that has been done. I mean, partly by the Danish group led by my colleague Joseph Parnasse, but also by people who has been working on this interface between philosophy and psychiatry. And I'm almost done now, so just a couple of more slides. So one thing that I also think is worth mentioning is that although the ease was initially developed in order to help again, identify and perhaps predict, later development of later schizophrenia. There has also been attempts in recent years to see whether one could use the ease in psychotherapy. And I think the guiding idea here has been that if the psychiatrist is to offer and conduct, sound psychotherapy, a careful understanding of the patient's experiential and existential situation is really an important precondition for this. And here, a careful psychopathological interview can be helpful. And some of the findings that has come out, and I mean, this is all very recent work, is that patients interviewed on the basis of the ease often express feelings of relief when realizing that the interviewer is familiar with the nature of the experiences and that other people obviously have similar experiences. So these are not, anomalous, strange experiences that are kind of unique to the patients. Actually something that one can talk with others about because they might also have them. This in itself can make the experience less frightening and disturbing. And I also think it's kind of interesting that the very fact of being listened to and taken seriously has a certain therapeutic value. Again, it can make the experiences less frightening. And often people, the patients who have been in treatment for years wonder why nobody ever asked them these questions before. And finally, being offered a certain vocabulary that allows them to talk about and describe these experiences also makes it easier for the patients to communicate what they're experiencing. And again, this might lead to an increased understanding from their significant others, which also is something that can bring reprieve. So, this is the idea of how this very careful, phenomenologically inspired interview can actually serve a certain psychotherapeutic, have a certain psychotherapeutic value. Okay, so to conclude, I think, perhaps not surprisingly, that it would be a mistake if psychiatry were to replace its person-centered approach with a subpersonal, brain circuit-centered approach. Now, importantly, that does not mean that it's wrong to conduct investigations into these subpersonal processes. Of course not, but the idea that should somehow, clean the table and totally push, an interest in the experience of the patient to the side strikes me as not only very wrong-headed, but I think also ethically quite problematic. I don't think you can really comprehend, let alone explain mental disorders unless you have a good understanding of the mental, of what consciousness is, of what experience is. And I think this is one of the reasons why phenomenology, but of course also philosophy of mind, has a kind of, I think, persistent relevance for psychiatry. Interestingly, in a recent survey of psychiatry residents at the Case Western Reserve University, 65% responded with yes or definitely yes to the statement that they struggle with conceptual and philosophical questions related to psychiatry in their dealings with patients. And only 4% responded with yes or definitely yes to the statement that their residency training had so far adequately prepared them to address these philosophical challenges. And I mean, again, I think this very clearly highlights what is specific to psychiatry. I mean, I guess, a nephrology specialist or an endocrinologist or a pediatrician would probably not have responded in the same way. So perhaps it would be a good idea if philosophy modules became mandatory part of the psychiatry specialization. Perhaps it would be a good idea for psychiatry to stand by its traditional links to philosophy in order to recognize its own distinctiveness. And I think one added reason for perhaps doing this might be that it could help it to attract new psychiatry. Because I mean, I know at least in Denmark that it's a constant struggle to actually convince people coming through what's it called, a medical school to choose psychiatry as their specialization, because it's typically not regarded as a very kind of prestigious field within the medical world. And I guess there are kind of two ways of dealing with that. One is to try to make it more akin to the other medical specializations, but as I've already suggested, my worry would be that one is thereby actually missing what is really distinctive about psychiatry as a discipline, missing what is distinctive about mental disorders. So I'm not sure that is a winning strategy. I mean, it might be better to really stand by the philosophical core of psychiatry, and I think potentially this could also lead to attracting, medical students who actually has a sincere interest in these aspects. So that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, for this informative and thought-provoking talk. So we have a number of questions, a large number of questions, but before we start looking at those, I was wondering whether you can give a brief answer to a very broad question, I guess, concerning the notion of the self. So you mentioned that the complexity of the concept of the self cannot be appropriately addressed through neuroscientific research and approaches which actually ask the question about the self, but by asking where the self is in the brain, as you mentioned earlier. So I was wondering from about your conception of the self, which I know is very complex and you develop it in many books of yours, but I was wondering what elements of your conception of the self you think might be useful for psychiatry to incorporate in their research and approaches to questions about the self.
Sure. But I mean, I'm pretty sure that to some extent all the different aspects would probably be relevant because, I mean, psychiatry is, of course, covering a lot of different diagnoses, and I think you can probably, go aspect to aspect and consider how different dimensions of the self might be afflicted and affected and disturbed in different psychiatric conditions. But let me make one point, and this is actually something that already Minkowski pointed out, because I think he made a very helpful comparison of the type of self-disorder that he thought one could find in dementia patients compared to patients with schizophrenia. And so what he said was, if we're talking about dementia patients, perhaps, severe Alzheimer patients, what the patient will have difficulty with is, knowing, his or her own name, knowing his or her own profession, knowing where his or her is located, knowing what year it is. So there are difficulties with all these kind of, if you will, objective features, location, time, profession, name. Whereas whereas if you go to the schizophrenia patient, and of course, there's a certain generalization involved here, but what the patient with schizophrenia typically has a problem with is not knowing that today it's November the 30th, or that I'm based in Copenhagen, or that my name is Dan Zahavi. No, what that patient has problems with is understanding what is here and what is now, and who am I? What does it mean to be a me or an I? So I think in both cases we are dealing with a certain problem with the self, but it's very different dimensions. And the people who perhaps it went a little bit fast, but perhaps you could see that I was actually one of the co-authors of the EASE publication. And the psychiatrist with whom I've been collaborating for many years, Joseph Parnasse, when he talks about self-disturbances, and the kind of self-disturbance that primarily has his interest is primarily a disturbance of this very, very fundamental level of selfhood that I'm also primarily interested in. So it's not about character traits, it's not about commitment to specific values. No, it's really about the fundamental structure of the first person perspective. And again, when patients are reporting that their first person perspective has suddenly shifted 2 centimeters to the right, this again is something very different from, for instance, establishing some kind of coherent, set of values. It's a very different, again, aspect or dimension of self that is afflicted. So I think there's a clear link between the kind of work I've been doing on the self and what these psychiatrists have been focusing on.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I'll read out some of the questions in the Q&A box, and my colleagues will help me also with some of the questions that people wanted to ask by raising their hands.
I wanted to interject just briefly. Audience members can help. If they like a question, they can upvote it, which might suggest that it's a more useful question, because we have 33 questions, and of course we will not be able to get all of them answered in the end of it. So please go ahead, Roxana, with the ones that stand out to you as most relevant.
So someone asks whether how does psychiatry? Oh, the screen is moving. I think as people are voting. Okay, so it was about the relation between philosophy and psychiatry in Denmark and in the US. Whether you think there is a difference and how do they compare? So that was one of the questions.
I think, perhaps I should actually be a bit more specific, because when I was saying psychiatry in Denmark, I should probably have said psychiatry in Copenhagen, because it's really, it's Joseph Parnasse and his group who for many years have been working on this specific link. And there are, of course, a lot of other Danish psychiatrists who have zero interest in phenomenology and who are very keen on promoting biological psychiatry. And I think one could say something similar in the US. Of course, the US is a much larger country, and so I guess it's also very diversified. And there are kind of pockets of people working with phenomenological psychiatry in the US as well. But of course, there are plenty of biological psychiatrists as well. There's no question. I don't want to in any way make it sound as if phenomenological psychiatry is a majority voice. I mean, I think what is distinctive about phenomenological psychiatry is that it has a very long heritage. It basically goes back all the way to the beginning and has always been there. And I think that one can witness a certain renaissance within the last 20 years. But of course, it still remains a minority position. But the fact, and I mean, I guess I won't hide that we were all very happy when we saw that the ICD-11 supposedly changed or included this reference to disturbed self-experiences in its kind of definition of schizophrenia. I think it has some impact even beyond the kind of narrow constraints of kind of phenomenology proper.
Okay, so thank you very much for this fascinating talk. You have insisted mainly on what philosophy can bring to the psychiatric discourse and research. My question concerns the other side of the coin, what philosophy and especially phenomenology can learn from psychiatry. What does it mean for the phenomenology of the self that psychosis exists? And maybe a little bit more precisely, ipsity disturbances are usually characterized by diminished self-affection and hyperreflexivity. How do you see the link in the light of your own research between self-affection and reflexivity, and how would you articulate these two forms of relating to the self affectively and reflectively in the light of your own research on the minimal self? That's a great question.
Okay, so that's a complicated question. So I think, I mean, let me perhaps primarily answer the first part of the question. I mean, what can philosophy learn from and phenomenology learn from psychiatry, which I think is absolutely an important question. And I think whoever asked this question are right in actually pinpointing this as a lacuna in my talk, because I should have addressed it as well. But I think it's interesting that if we go back to Minkowski, I mean, he's actually pretty clear about the fact that it's a mutual enlightenment. And I mean, I'm using this term on a purpose because some of you might know that this was a term that Sean Gallagher, who might actually be in attendance, if he hasn't already left, he told me he would attend the talk, that he introduced in describing the relationship between cognitive science and phenomenology, where the proposal was that both sides can kind of illuminate one another. And so Minkowski was saying precisely that. So on the one hand, he was saying phenomenology can offer certain tools, certain concepts, certain descriptive demarcations that are useful for the psychiatrist. But at the same time, the psychiatrist, by conducting this careful investigation of disordered experiences, might actually pinpoint facets and dimensions of experience and structures of experience that might have been overlooked by the phenomenologist because of his or her concern with kind of normal, ordinary experience. So there was this idea that actually the phenomenological investigation of consciousness can be enriched and made more complex by attending to all these unusual experiences. And I think, I mean, one slightly different way of putting it is in the following way, that sometimes we really need the anomalies or the kind of disturbances or the absence to highlight some of those structures that are so fundamental to our being in the world that we don't really attend to them because they are just so basic. So it's the moment that they don't work well, or the moment that they are absent, that we can actually, that we are kind of called to notice their presence. And I think psychopathology might serve a similar function. And so then quickly moving to the second part of your question, I think that very briefly put, and this has been a little bit, this might be a little bit a technical answer, but your question was a bit technical as well. One question to ask would be the following: if one kind of accepts this notion of a minimal self that I have been promoting over the years, where the self is taken to be a very fundamental, integral part of phenomenal consciousness, one might wonder whether it can actually be disturbed at all. I mean, does it even make sense to speak of a disturbance that are so fundamental that it somehow has an impact on that level? And there has always been a little bit of a tension between, on the one hand, this idea that selfhood is so basic to conscious experience that we cannot have conscious experience in its absence, and this claim that what is somehow afflicted in schizophrenia is somehow that very basic level of selfhood. And so recently I published an article together with Parnas and another colleague of mine, Mads Henriksen, where we basically proposed the following. We kind of distinguished three different possibilities and then opted for the third. And I think this can be seen as a way of somehow also, I mean, it was a way for me also to profit from the psychopathological investigation. And so what are the three options? Very briefly, the first option would be to say, in thought insertion or in these severe forms of psychosis, the first person perspective, the notion of for me-ness, the self is completely gone, it's completely absent, completely destroyed. So that's one option. The second option is to say that notion or that dimension is so basic that it cannot in any way be done away with. So whatever affliction or whatever disturbance or disorder we are talking about has to pertain to higher levels of selfhood. And then the third option, which was the one we kind of wanted to defend, was the idea that, well, we have to distinguish between the claim that the minimal self is absent or gone or destroyed, the claim that it's totally fine, and the claim that it's precisely disordered and disturbed or fragile. And so I think that what we wanted to say is, well, there is a certain fragility to this fundamental notion of self, or this fundamental stream of self-experience. And one of the ways in which that fragility is showing itself is that whereas we in normal life might have a very easy time moving from kind of pre-reflective self-experience to a reflective articulation of those experiences using the first person pronoun, that switch from pre-reflective experience to reflective articulation just seems to be much, much more difficult for patients suffering from, for instance, these self-disorders. So there seems to be something odd or something, I mean, it's not gone totally, but there seems to be something not working as in the normal case. And I mean, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the end of that investigation. I just wanted to highlight it as one way where I actually think that my philosophical understanding or my philosophical conception of the minimal self have actually profited from these psychopathological explorations.
Okay, thank you. So this was a question from Istvan Fazakas. Now from another question from Alexandra Jewell. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your names. This happens in my case all the time. So from Alexandra, I agree that our ambition to reduce the personal to subpersonal neural and microscopic processes misses the very thing that is essential to psychiatric disorders. But what would you say to neuroscientists who say that this is ultimately an empirical question, and in the future we will be capable of finding fine-grained activation patterns that can aid in the diagnosing and treatment of psychiatric disorders?
Yeah, well, but I think, I mean, saying that I think is less radical, and perhaps that is implied in your question. I think is less radical than the kind of full-blown kind of reductionism, which doesn't merely say that those fine-grained analysis might help the diagnosis, but which basically would say that's all we need in order to make the diagnosis. And I mean, it's the latter claim that I'm opposed to. So I wouldn't in any way kind of dispute that further neuroscientific, I mean, that neuroscience as it progresses will be able to help, and of course also in the treatment. I mean, I'm not speaking out against neuropharmacology at all, but I just think that it's important always to remember that when we are investigating the brain in order to help clarify or solve or address problems regarding, consciousness, I mean, if that's why we are investigating the brain, which presumably is what biological psychiatrists are doing, I mean, they cannot do that without at the same time preserving an interest in and concern with and interaction with the patient. I mean, I just think, I mean, that idea that one can somehow completely dismiss the personal level strikes me as basically absurd. I have to say that. And I mean, I think, think of all the scanning experiments that are being conducted, where, more and more fine-grained tools can allow us to observe the brain, in vivo, so to say, or brain activities in vivo. Now, what are you going to use all those data for unless you somehow correlate it with reports from the subject? I mean, if you didn't have those reports, then simply by looking at the brain, I mean, you wouldn't have any idea what kind of mental aspect was correlated with. So, I mean, so again, just to quickly reply, I don't have a problem with, and I don't have any principal problem with the proposal that neuroscience can help us make the diagnosis more precise, but it has to be a neuroscience that keeps, that continues to have a link with a kind of personal level investigation.
Okay, so a question from Shad Murad Musa. Wittgensteinian pragmatists define psychopathology as the loss of natural self-evidence or the loss of common sense. They call for some sort of epistemicization, or where psychopathology is merely the loss of Wittgensteinian hinges of practical certainties. My question is that what the fundamental advantage phenomenology can have over and above this kind of pragmatism in understanding psychopathology?
Well, I mean, given the way you are framing the Wittgensteinian take, I mean, I would certainly see a number of overlaps, because again, I mean, when Minkowski talks about this loss of vital contact with reality, and when Blankenburg talks about a loss of natural evidence, I mean, this all kind of, I think, goes in the same direction. But then you can ask, what might be the advantage of the psychiatric investigation? Well, I mean, I have to say, I don't really know much about a specific Wittgensteinian tradition in psychiatry, and that is probably myself that I have to blame. But I think that presumably, I mean, so this might be one proposal. I mean, when the psychiatrists, I mean, the phenomenological psychiatrists are drawing on phenomenology, I mean, they are also drawing on, careful investigations of intentionality, time consciousness, body awareness, the experience of space, forms of social interaction. And I mean, I'm just wondering whether all those fine-grained analysis that they are relying on, I mean, it's not totally clear to me that you can actually find that kind of resources in the work of Wittgenstein. So perhaps there's an added advantage to what the psychiatrist drawing on phenomenology might have here. But I think I'm a little bit hampered by not knowing sufficiently about the role that Wittgenstein had played in psychiatry. So I don't think I can say much more.
So another question, there's a treatment therapy for medication-resistant depression and anxiety called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, where magnetic waves are pulsed to the brain in efforts to activate neurons, and somehow that would help with the depression by awakening cells that aren't doing their job, or perhaps getting in the way of other cells doing their job. It is relatively quite a newly approved treatment that doesn't reach many people. Essentially a treatment biologically minded to address conditions of depression and anxiety. Do you have any thoughts on it?
I mean, you know, I have to confess that my knowledge of psychiatry is very, it's perhaps not surprising, but very kind of colored by, you know, the work done by this colleague of mine, Joseph Parnasse. And I mean, his primary interest has always been schizophrenia and not depression. So I know far less about depression, I'm afraid. And I don't know anything about the treatment that you are mentioning. And so I don't also know, yeah, so I also don't know about the outcome. I mean, does it completely cure them? Do the patients need further psychotherapy afterwards? So again, I mean, I'm sorry. I wish I could say more. But I just don't know enough about it.
Okay, so we have a question from Professor Anita Avramidis.
Sorry, I can't actually figure out a way to write it, so I'll just ask it quickly, Dan. I was just struck by your citing of the more broken brain approach and the neuroscientists who take for granted a notion of self, right? And then you go on to explain how we really shouldn't do that, and we have a more sophisticated way of exploring the self in phenomenology and philosophy. But then I was thinking, when these patients talk about the self, they're not philosophers. They have a very common sense notion of the self. So maybe the neuroscientists aren't so wrong to have a you know, very rough and ready conception.
But that's an interesting, but you know, because I think it raises a different question, which is the following. And which has been a slightly contentious issue also in these discussions among philosophers interested in psychiatry. And so it concerns this question of how to engage with the patients. And I think there is a distinction to be made between taking the patient serious and kind of being concerned with the patient's experiences, and taking the patient literal and just saying, you know, whatever the patient says is a correct description of what the patient is experiencing, and that has to be what we are kind of using as our kind of descriptive correlate. And I would say it's really important not to conflate those two things, because I don't think you can take it for granted that the patient is automatically in a position to give a very fine-grained, careful description of what he or she is actually experiencing. So I think what is coming out of this interview is actually more a kind of maieutic project. I mean, where the psychiatrist, by probing and returning to the question, slowly, you know, urges the patient to offer more refined descriptions. And so what I'm trying to say is, I mean, it might well be that the patient perhaps does not have a very sophisticated conceptual apparatus, but I don't think that shows that we as philosophers or we as psychopathologists then shouldn't make use of such a fine-grained conceptual apparatus, because I think that will ultimately allow us to actually unearth more of what is going on in the patient's experiential life than otherwise. And of course, I mean, it's of course a complicated discussion, and I realize that there could be this worry that, well, ultimately it's just a psychiatrist who is projecting all his or her favorite notions onto the patient and continuing asking the patient until the patient ends up saying yes or no. But I mean, I don't really think that is actually what is happening in a proper psychopathological interview. So again, I don't think that we should just remain satisfied with just letting the patient have the last. I mean, well, the patient should have the last word, but we shouldn't let the first word of the patient be the last word. If you get my point.
Yeah, Professor Avramidis, want to say anything else on this? Or?
No, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So we have time for one or two more questions. What is your own take on Jaspers' pessimism about the prospects of understanding the primary experience of delusion, what he calls a total transformation in the subject's reality sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, well, that's interesting, because I mean, one of the things that Jaspers is known for is that he claims that when it comes to, I guess, primarily to kind of schizophrenia, I mean, there's a certain kind of incomprehensibility. So there's a certain limit to what the psychiatrist can understand. And if I recall correctly, I mean, Jaspers also argues that this experience of ununderstandability is actually has a certain diagnostic value, I mean, for the psychiatrist. So when the psychiatrist has this experience of simply not understanding what in heaven's name the patient is talking about, I mean, that can actually, be a kind of indicator that we are dealing with schizophrenia. And here I think that some of the later phenomenological psychiatrists might actually have been slightly more optimistic. I mean, and I think this kind of perhaps also points to this distinction between Jaspers on the one side and Minkowski on the other that I briefly alluded to, where Jaspers, and I hope this is not too much of a caricature, but kind of were interested in, describing different symptoms in a kind of comprehensive manner, whereas Minkowski was saying, well, this is not really enough. You need to try to understand how they all hang together and what kind of more fundamental disturbance we are dealing with. And I think that, I mean, my understanding is that Minkowski would actually, be prepared to go a step further and say that there is a certain, we can make a certain progress as psychiatrists into understanding that which Jaspers thought was basically beyond beyond comprehension. And I mean, of course, I have to emphasize now, I'm not a psychiatrist. I do not perform psychopathological interviews, so perhaps I'm not the best person to ask. But I mean, I think this is a somewhat faithful report of what my psychiatry colleagues are also telling me.
Okay, thank you. There are a large number of questions, but I'm afraid, we're running out of time. So I'm really sorry that we couldn't go through all the questions. I'd like to thank Professor Zahavi very much for this engaging and thought-provoking talk. And hopefully in the future we can meet in person and have more chance to discuss these issues in more detail, in further detail. Okay, thank you so much for being with us here today. And if you wish to be on the mailing list for the Oxford Forum, please feel free to email me or let me know via Facebook or other social media ways. Thank you very much, Stephanie and Kim, for being here and helping, and for the Stanford University Center in Oxford for hosting this event. So thank you. And
Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot. And it's great meeting you all.